Hello and welcome, everyone. This is a Catholic Money Mastermind podcast, and I'm joined here today with Wyatt O'Rourke out of the Denver, Colorado area, Basilic Financial. Wyatt, you are such an interesting guy. I'm so looking forward to this conversation today. We're going to be talking about a lot of neat things, folks, but specifically, it's like this intersection of tradition and innovation. And in what ways should we be looking to the past for wisdom and understanding and guarding and protecting what has come before us, but at the same time, what ways should we be looking into the future and changing it up a little bit, and having optimism and hope and a willingness to embrace change. And it's not a conversation that you necessarily have every day, especially within maybe a Catholically themed podcast. So, Wyatt, I'm looking forward to digging into all that with you. But maybe before we get too far along, can you just maybe introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Ben. Long-time listener, first-time caller, so excited to be on. But I'm Wyatt O'Rourke. I was born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin. Currently live in Denver with my wife, Macy. We're expecting our first child this summer, which we're very excited about. I always joke, and this resonates more with my Bitcoin friends and clients, but I was traditionally trained in finance, and I worked in various forms of finance, but I've always really kind of identified more as an entrepreneur. Had a startup previously that went under, and when I was just after that experience reaching out to friends and mentors, trying to decide what's next. Ultimately, kind of decided I was going to pursue the RIA route, but kind of helping friends and family with this sort of stuff anyway. And so it was kind of a natural evolution for me, and decided to go fully independent from the get-go, because I'm a bit stubborn. Like to do things my own way, which is the entrepreneur side of things. But at Basilic, our slogan is prosperity with purpose. We focus, a lot on, obviously, the money side matters, and we do dig into the numbers, but we really try to, lead with a human first approach and help our clients find, funded contentment where money and meaning are in balance. And we focus a lot on like the qualitative nature of how we view money, where we're trying to go with our lives, how we can be good stewards of our wealth, and really, hone in on the personal side of things. Obviously, the faith has a lot to do with that, and it's certainly, a guide for me working with clients, and just try to instill a lot of that wisdom that I've learned through the church into our day-to-day operations.
Wyatt, I'm curious in the name, Basilic Financial. It's not something that I've come across before, and you were sharing it ahead of our call as we were meeting that there's a backstory to it. So, and I think it'll be a nice segue into a lot of what we want to chat on between this notion of innovation and tradition. What's the backstory to the name of the firm?
Yeah, no, definitely. I do kind of like to get a little romantic with names. I think that, they carry a lot of meaning. And so when I was, naming it, I am a bit of a history buff as well. So I really wanted to try to find something, really kind of in the weeds that, ultimately kind of, proclaim my mission and what we're about. And so I do kind of brand myself as a Bitcoin financial advisor. We do a lot of work with Bitcoin, around Bitcoin, custody solutions, how it integrates a financial plan, in addition to, traditional capital markets and whatnot. But Basilic comes from, it was actually the fall of Constantinople. It was the first major cannon battle in history, and Basilic was the largest cannon. And, Constantinople had this lore of, these great walls that, had never been breached. And it was actually, a new technology that came about that, ultimately led to a bit of a paradigm shift and shift in history as we know it. So it took, cannons to bring down the walls. And obviously that was something not previously available in warfare. And so it really kind of, stands for a new technology taking down the old guard and how we embrace that.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating idea. And obviously this is directly connected with, Bitcoin, and I think your interest and passion and advocacy for Bitcoin. And I think there's a connection with how you're seeing Bitcoin to be the new guard, seeking to take down the old guard. So we can spend some time chatting, on Bitcoin as a subject matter, although I'd like to save maybe some of that conversation for another subject in which we really get into the roots of it amongst a number of us. But what is more interesting, or at least that I would like to pull out conversation-wise, is just, this perpetual tendency amongst humans we build up our walls to protect ourselves. And I can't very well disagree with that. It's what I do in my own life. And in some ways, that's what we're doing in our guidance with our clients. We're looking to protect and grow our wealth. But at the same time, technology does grow and advance and improvements are had. And I don't want to know if I would like to describe it as an aggressor, but there's a bit of a threat, or there is consistently in human history always someone wanting to push the envelope and take things to that next level. And part of, I think, growing yourself is when to recognize, perhaps to make a change and a pivot, because like that's not gonna stop or go away. Like humans just have this drive, this propensity for this sort of thing. And if we get stuck in saying like, no, things have to be this way, we can't have it any other way. Well, we're just going to get out pivoted at the end of the day, right? Somebody's going to come by and take our walls down, maybe, to that example, there is no one thing that we can do that will permanently always work and forever endure, at least not in any sense of a temporal mission. Like it's just not within our keeping. But on matters of faith, yes, maybe, we aspire and believe such things, but even that is, the endurance of such a thing isn't from us. It's coming from God. So I'm kind of just curious to get your thoughts, on this notion of just how long does anything really endure? Maybe speaking to that Constantinople wall, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ben, and it's a bit of a gray area, and that's right. Like those are the areas like most can dive into because they have like the most room for discussion and discourse. And I'm a firm believer in humans are technological beings. Like it is inherent gift from God, and I think we were made this way in His image and likeness. And so over time, like there's a reason we're not still in caves. And that's a good thing. And specifically when I talked to I identify as like pretty conservative and traditional in a lot of ways. But it's fairly easy for me to kind of segment these two things. And so I do definitely get some pushback, which I welcome. But, I'm a self-proclaimed, techno optimist as well. And, I buy a lot into like the fourth turning thesis, which is kind of like generally summed up in like the meme, strong men create good times, create weak men, yada, yada. And so, we're constantly like evolving as a species. And I think that's very, natural. And, I think I also believe that Christianity, gave rise to the West, and the West has been like the pinnacle of human flourishing. And there was no doubt that technology played a huge part in that. And so when I'm kind of evaluating our current landscape, and I do try to be careful. I enjoy macroeconomics, but it's easy to get caught up in. These are very complex global systems. There's a lot of variables, and if you get like too in the weeds, I think it's easy to connect your own dots and kind of like paint your own picture, and then you ultimately end up missing the story. So I do try to be observer from a 30,000 foot view, and technology is a massive part of our lives now, and I think that's a very good thing. However, when I'm evaluating our current landscape and viewing it, I think it's good we embrace technology in our daily lives, in our investment strategies, but it needs to be, and you kind of alluded to this, kind of like monitored or reined in. And that's where I bring in the tradition, and that's like our moral worldview. And, there's, specifically great Catholic scientists that, have pushed the envelope in technology, but they were guided by, Catholic or at least Christian, moral worldview. So, I've had a bit of a reconversion story over the last 3 years. Unfortunately, a bit of a classic story. I went to Catholic school, fell away from the faith in high school and college, and then fortunately refound it. And as I've been experiencing this reconversion story and getting more into my faith and learning about it, one of the things that I think has been profoundly had a profound effect on me, just looking at the Bible, for example, or church teachings. It was like, hold on a second, like I actually don't need to rethink the wheel here. It's like we have 2,000 years of teachings to rely on, and just think of church doctors like St. Thomas Aquinas. It's like a brilliant man who's like thought about a lot of these things as a young man myself, and grappling with, and it's like, what, this work's actually already been done, right? I just actually need to be humble enough to reflect on it and embrace it. And so I honestly kind of largely think as the Bible is like a playbook how we should live our lives, how we should think about things, how we should go about, affecting change and spreading the gospels. And so if you kind of take, a moral framework to go out in the world to guide yourself with, I think embracing technology actually becomes, much more obtainable. And it also allows us to, guide us on like, okay, yes, which technology to embrace. I think this is a medium of good or a medium of evil. And that's always been the case. I think it's always been, a battle of good and evil, regardless of what technology emerges. Us as humans need to, ultimately take God's guidance on how to approach it, but it doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't approach it.
Absolutely. Because without technology, there's, if we had no technological advancements, we'd have no change. That almost would be fundamentally what would be implied on that. And what we're also kind of asserting or stating is that things as they are today are as perfect or as complete as they'll ever get. And so any change there from this point on is like a decline, like we're getting away from, this prior point of the height of civilization. And, I think, in studying history, there's definitely ebbs and flows and high points and low points and, good times and bad times. And so naturally enough, maybe we don't want to lose if we feel like we're living in a good time. We don't want to make any changes that would lead to a bad time. It isn't as if all change always leads to good times. So it's like we can't go wrong. We definitely can go wrong, right? So there is concern to make sure that we're making good decisions, individually as a society as much as we can. But we have to be willing, I think, to change. And a lot of what undergirds this, it's like inherent within these biblical principles, matters of faith, church teaching or doctrine, is a willingness to see that the order that we live in isn't completely up to us and designed and controlled by us, and it's only in the hands of someone else, namely God, right? God our Father. And so we we can surrender, we can abandon, we can trust ourselves to Him and to His plan, and have principles of faith, of belief to guide our actions, and only trust in the goodness, perhaps fallen or brokenness of our human nature, but still the goodness of our human nature that God is moving and directing and leading us into hopefully better and better things. And so change isn't inherently or necessarily wrong or bad. There is a tendency for us to fight against it, even though we've benefited from it. Maybe that's just because we don't want to lose what we have. We're afraid that if we make any changes, what we have will get lost to us. But I don't know, that's what I'm trying to balance out here, is that there's this, if our treasure is not here on this earth, but in God and in heaven, and a willingness to risk, to go back to that theme of entrepreneurship, a willingness to risk what we have in order to advance ourselves into the future, then we can let go. We can let go of of our fear, let go of what could go wrong, and take on a willingness to go out into the deep and ultimately, trust God, trust that, hey, like this is His plan. He's the one who's really behind this, and He does want and desire our good. So yes, this change maybe is scary, but we're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. So does that kind of reiterate, is that your thinking or thought on the matter as well?
Yeah, 100%. There's this great website that, of course, I can't think of the name of right now, but essentially all they do is just like archive like old newspaper headlines. And it was, it's like late 1800s, early 1900s, whenever this particular headline came out, they were talking about, electricity and power lines, in the United States. And the headline was like the devil from above. And, people were terrified about, power lines and, electricity being in every home and building. And technology ultimately is it's a tool ideally used for human flourishing and prosperity, but it's also a paradigm shift, right? So we have something new, and it's could potentially fundamentally change or alter how we operate on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, at times, like you said, that absolutely could be perceived as scary, but as long as we have a very I would say rooted and structural moral worldview to assess these things as they come to us, like we should be able to discern, how that change is going to affect us. And, there are certain times, we, like you mentioned, change is bad, and, we should be, discerned to fight that change. And ultimately that comes down to, the individual making an informed decision for themselves. But ultimately that's like guided and rooted in something that has stood the test of time. There's this idea called like the Lindy Effect, where if it's been around a long time, like it's likely to be, around for, a long time going forward. And, just in our current day and age, I think this is, very kind of, seen in like woke ideology. I think, wokeism is, religion, but it's been around for 10, 20 years or whatever. So it doesn't have, a long or high likelihood of lasting that long or longer into the future. Whereas you look at something like Christianity, has been around for 2,000 years. Like there's actually very few things that have been around for 2,000 years. So if we're rooted and use principles, that are in line with the Lindy Effect, like it becomes, a lot easier to assess these things for ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to kind of pull these 2 points together, because we've been talking about change and innovation, and, innovation inherently, it's change, right? It's what's new. And at the beginning, for anything, to go back to the point of tradition, like anything, tradition is fundamentally handing off things from one generation to the next. It's literally like a baton going from one person to the next is what tradition is. But someone initially had to have come up with the baton. So, I mean, like almost everything, right? Maybe all things are rooted in innovation. Like at some point, something brought the baton around for it to be passed on. And it would be a little silly. And I definitely not within the church's teaching on this to hold ourselves, fast to only, just because it came before us, it must be what gets passed on. Like there can be a discernment to say that this, maybe this isn't appropriate any longer, especially in what we call small t traditions. Like it's dated and doesn't work. It made sense at one point in its time, but it doesn't make sense now. But I mean, more to the bigger T tradition that we're alluding to, like there is, like, let's just talk a little bit about the wisdom of those who've come before us. And you had alluded to this a little bit with St. Thomas and Aquinas, amongst others, that like, it's not like the people who came before us are idiots. Right? They just kind of speak rather bluntly about it. Like, I mean, they're human beings too. And, they took their reasoning powers as best as they can and made sense of the world. And like, there's a lot of wisdom actually in their thinking. I mean, they weren't, just because they were generations ago doesn't mean like they're morons. So like there is an issue of like, what can we gather? What kind of wisdom has kind of fallen out over the generations that like is as applicable today as it was back then, but will be as applicable into the future. Do you just see then, like in terms of latching on to the tradition and knowing like what to keep and maybe what to be willing to change, like the combination of these two is just being, equally rooted within perhaps, let's say, church teaching, but then also just saying like, let's open up the doors to the future and see what comes. We're not going to hold ourselves necessarily back. Is that kind of, because it's an interesting tension, between the two of them. I'm kind of curious to see just how you're seeking to live them.
No, totally. It certainly can be a tension, and this is like one of those gray areas, we talked about that I like to dive into. And depending on like what website you look on or how you splice it, I'm either like the youngest millennial, like the oldest Gen Z, and so in my kind of cohort, specifically secular people, I tend to work with a little bit of a younger clientele. There's a lot of despair. I do think not to talk out both sides of my mouth, but I talked about technology very favorably a lot. I think social media as an example has a tremendous benefits. It can do a tremendous amount of good, but this is something that can easily spiral into bad. And I think one of the bad aspects of it as well is like, it's very much like promotes like the obsession of self, and people get like their own heads, and then they kind of feel this despair, and it's like, oh, why am I not happy, or why do I feel this way, or X, Y, Z, you can name it. And to me, it just seems like such a silly question, because it's like, you are not the first human who has thought this, it's like, and that's where, I lean back on the tradition and wisdom that have come before us, where it's like, this is almost, a fundamental, human question. And it's kind of ignorant of us to, think we're the first ones to have, encountered it. It's like, yes, like the circumstances of like today are different from the circumstances of yesterday, but that doesn't mean like the fundamental question still hasn't, existed. And this is where, I get a lot of, strength and leaning on tradition, or, previous teachings, because like a lot of the wisdom, and that's kind of like the thing with wisdom, it applies, regardless of technology or time, but that doesn't mean like you can't embrace it, and we should embrace that. And, specifically, within the church, something I'm very bullish on and excited about and trying to participate in is I'm a parishioner at Our Lady of Lourdes in Denver. It's a phenomenal parish, and it's predominantly young adults, but I do think it's actually, specifically in America, it's like the young people that are actually leading this, return to tradition, because we've actually seen, the folks around us or, grown up with who maybe didn't have like the faith to, rely on or fall back to, that they aren't able to, grapple with these things. I think like the family's been under attack for a long time. It's like, well, our church friends are, growing families, and it's like, we want to have children. And it's like, well, why do we want to have children? It's because that's actually like a great source of happiness, and people have been doing it literally for a millennia. And just to think like over the last 25 years, just for a easy cutoff, to think that was all of a sudden going to change is like nonsensical, right? And so we should reject like this modern notion that, the dinks, dual income, no kids, and, you'll find fulfillment in that, and actually, embrace tradition and, our history and our vocations. It's like, no, you're actually, called to be a mother or a father. And this is, something good, and, something I'm looking forward to experiencing for the first time this summer. But, fortunately, we have a great community with a lot of young kids who have been able to just draw on the wisdom from my hyper local community. And, talking to my men's group, we've had like 5 babies, over the last 4 or 5 months. And so it's just been an absolute blessing of life. And it's like, hey, what have you experienced? What should I be prepared for? And these are, fundamentally, crucial things to, I think, our human nature. It's like, we're not meant to be individuals. We're social beings as well as technological beings. And it's like, the more like we embrace that, I think we'll lead more fruitful lives. And I think this is just one of many scenarios where we should, reject modernism and, and this, growing trend as well. Even the New York Times, which I think is a cesspool of a newspaper, had an article recently where it's like 70% of newly ordained priests identify as, conservative. And so it's like, I think we are really seeing, a return to, tradition and reverence. And that's something I'm totally here for and embrace and want myself. But just because, we are returning to tradition on a lot of, quote unquote, like standard norms, doesn't mean we're not going to be using Zoom. It doesn't mean like you and I are going to like get in person to record this podcast. It's like, no, we have technological tools that are, better suited to do the job. It's like, doesn't mean we need to totally reject those. And so a lot of times I think, what I mean when I try to like segment these things is, so if we just think of, technology as a tool that, we can apply, just, like a hammer is a tool, doesn't mean, we should reject like the tradition of our, morals or our ethics, because those I think are much harder to change. And I would actually push back on change, in those realms, because I honestly don't think they should be changing, or they can change. I think there's a lot of these things we've actually found the solution to, and you just kind of have to have the humility to admit it.
Yeah, it's just a great point to turn around and be like, look, to some of you've kind of hit upon this, like, we're not out to reinvent the wheel. And so that's kind of is a funny thing, again, the tension, because like, well, part of innovation is in some ways to reinvent the wheel, but then like, we can't reinvent everything. Innovation can't take over, or can't be the only thing that we have in the future, because what it can start to have is a hopelessness or a pointlessness, or like, I don't understand, especially when we match into that, the struggles or the sufferings or the challenges that we face in life. And especially when those hardships are severe, and they can be, for sure. Like, it's making sense or finding meaning in that. Speaking to what you had shared a little earlier about maybe a generation looking ahead and despairing, like financial progress, technological progress, like we won't keep moving forward unless we have hope in the future. And so even as much as if you want to just be like, oh, technology is our savior, like it's our Messiah, like this is what's going to save us. It's like, well, we have to have like hope that it actually will do that. And at some point, like, what's the buoy, with, the support for that hope. Like, I don't know if we can attach it and put it on just ourselves. Like we start to question or doubt humanity's capacity for these things like, well, it's, we're too broken or too feeble, or, people are too corrupt, or, there's too much injustice, whatever it is. Like it's a pipe dream, a utopia that we're, hoping to accomplish with innovation. And then like the whole thing starts to come crashing down. And so like there's this need, I think fundamentally in all financial matters to, there's a book out there called The Triumph of the Optimist. Like, we have to have optimism. And so there's, it's the optimism that pushes us forward into innovation and allows for new things. But then the question is where is that optimism coming from? And, I would say that it would be matters of faith. That's just kind of like how the two of these are being connected together. Like the optimism allows for the innovation and the change and the new future. And to some extent, maybe the hope. But then, what is supporting that optimism? Well, it's the falling back, at least I think within Christian faith or something. There has to, something has to support that optimism. I'm kind of curious in your story. I mean, I know that you had fallen away and then you'd come back, and was that kind of a driving factor? Is like in the absence of faith, I have no optimism. So like I need something. Like I see no point to life, or maybe if you don't want to speak to that, or just something like what does support somebody in the absence of faith for their optimism for the future? Like I don't even know what would be a solution there otherwise. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, it's a great question. I'm honestly not so sure. Like for myself specifically, I index to technology and just like, because nobody likes a doomer. And, it's like, I don't think that's like a good way to live, in general. But I specifically index to technology, and it's like, oh, this is awesome. Like there's so many, good things. And, it's obviously easy to, fall into the trap of being negative. I think it's much easier to be negative than it is, positive. And even, to use a specific, Catholic example here on like the two, blending, together. I'm a network state enthusiast. Are you familiar with like the network state ideology?
I'm not, no.
It was proposed by Balaji Srinivasan, who's a brilliant man. And the whole idea is kind of like cloud power to land power. And so this is just kind of like he, brings a lot of points, together very well and artistically, but, again, changing, global dynamic, changing global order, our money's in flux, borders are in flux, but people are still want to, aggregate with people who share the same beliefs and values. And so it's a whole idea. It's like, he uses an example. It's like, well, you probably have more in common with like your internet friend than you do like your next door neighbor. And that's because you've actually sought out somebody, with similar interests. And so the network state movement is definitely, gaining traction. And there's part of it that is, hyper, technology focused, which, it has its good and bad elements. But I think, a Catholic example is like Ave Maria in Florida. It's like, you don't start a town based on, the Catholic faith by like handing out newspapers. It's like that would be an ineffective way. So it's like, I think, a lot of that success has been like, using the internet to, get the message out. It's like, hey, we're planting our flag here. Are you in or are you out? Yeah. And it's like, you can actually, use technology, leverage technology to, find those people, bring them into your community, build a stronger community. And, that's something that I think the church has done, over the course of its history, obviously using, the means available to it. So, we definitely shouldn't stop that now. It hasn't been stopped in the past. And, going into the future, we'll have to adapt to the current times. I did see a great meme, though. This is something, again, we should be, cognizant of, where I do think, the church has potentially failed. I'm not saying like these are easy questions or it's easy to discern in the moment, but, post Vatican II, 70s and 80s, try to be, a church of the world as opposed to, a church, for the world or, affecting the world. And so like, there are definitely, certain standards like we need to, uphold and maintain. And again, it's having that individual discernment on how we use the technology of our time to further propagate, our mission.
Yeah. Yeah. What I like, one of the things I pulled out of that from Wyatt is this notion of community and the importance of community, and like how really the two of these are working together between innovation and tradition, or only, their goals is to build community, and I maybe there's the importance of, they're knowing something by its fruit, right? And so it's like,
Yes.
we know that we're on the right path here if we can start to see this manifest itself in the manner of the community that's being built. Is it being seen as desirable by others? Are others getting along and agreeing with it and getting behind you with it? Or is a degree of acquiescing. There's all, to some of the points that you had shared earlier, right? I mean, we can't, we have to have a moment of humility and say, like, I can't have everything my way, because there's certainly not going to be any community in that, right? And so, like, all community has some degree of like bearing with each other and maybe going one way that isn't necessarily the way you would have it, but like it's the way that seems to be best for everyone that's involved. And so, like, this, I don't know, this fluidness, this dynamic of life, of looking back, to the past for guidance and understanding and a rootedness, as you've used a few times, which I really, really love that idea, this rootedness, but then not stopping or trying to hold back, the turning of time and collapsing ourselves to say, like, this is how life has to be and it should stay this way. Almost like The Village of sorts, if you've ever seen that movie with M. Night Shyamalan. It's like accepting at the same time the future and what the future holds, and having optimism and belief in that, and not being afraid fundamentally. I mean, I think that's the thing that I think even in my own life, but I see it in my clients for sure. Just, when you have change, there's always this fear of, what may I lose? And perhaps part of our work, especially as advisors, is to reframe that and be like, well, what is there for us to gain, right? Like, what does this technology allow for us, and how could this be beneficial and good? And so I kind of be curious to just hear your take on your optimism maybe in technology, or how that can be good for us, or how you have seen it to be good for us.
Absolutely. So to your point too, I think community is paramount. And again, kind of my generation, unfortunately, I think we've seen a profound loss of community. And I think there's a myriad of reasons why. But fortunately, I do feel like I've been called to really build community, and that's something I spend a lot of time on. So fortunately, I think that the Catholic Church has, given us, again, great tools to work with. If you just think of like the parish, it's like there was some sort of geographical, boundary. It's like, this is your community. This is your community center, being the physical church. This is where we congregate. And, you could even see or use like the car as a technological evolution. And it's very easy to drive past, 3 parish boundaries, to get to, your desired parish. But it wasn't always that way, right? And I actually kind of view the car as more of a negative technological advancement than a positive one, but that's just an example here. And so what I see from myself and a lot of other young people is like, okay, we've kind of had this void. A lot of our communities have been eroded, and it's up to us to rebuild them. And I think that comes first and foremost, like getting involved with your parish. I think that's extremely, important. And again, that's like a tradition that shouldn't be forgotten, because, community is extremely important. We are social beings. But then, kind of, using technology, there's, Meetup is an app, to like get like-minded folks, together easily that you may not have known, otherwise. I hope found the space, which is a Bitcoin Citadel here in Denver. And, we kind of rallied around, Bitcoin being a way for us to, which is, predominantly like an online movement, which again has a lot of strengths, but there's no, replacing that, in real life benefits of getting together with people you share, a common interest. And so, we've actually, crowdfunded, a building. This is like a community run effort. And, we've actually gotten some, national recognition for, doing this. We're not like the first, Bitcoin Citadel. There's about 4 or 5 of us in the country, but, it takes a lot of work to, get people on the same page, organized. But to your point, like the fruits of that are extremely plentiful. And it's like one of my, I always tell people, I think this might be the coolest project I work on in my career. Well, don't make any money from it, but it's just like the community aspect of like, being with people and building something together. And, that's another thing about, community. It doesn't just, snap of fingers overnight. Like, oh, we have a community now. It takes a lot of time, effort, and work to build something. And usually, again, we can look back to tradition. If you like put those things, together and you keep at it, it's like those are the most prosperous things because it takes, real world physical effort to do something. And ultimately that kind of just means it has more, staying power. And so, I'm very bullish on community. I think it's, absolutely something, paramount. And I do think it's, a shame a lot of young people, specifically don't feel like they need that, or they may find out superficial, communities and like a softball league or something. But, you really need to, be with people that you share more than like a surface level, interest with, because that's ultimately where a lot of fruit is born. And some we've talked about, my local communities as well. I talk about a lot about this with my wife. So like, we're transplants to Colorado, and we love it out here. And fun fact about Colorado, there's always been more people, moving here that have been born here. So throughout the course of this, so throughout the course of the state's history, it's always been growing in population because, it's always been, attracting people. So a lot of friends from the parish, like their families, aren't in Colorado. So it's, well, I do believe, and now that I'm starting to undertake this journey, it takes a village to, raise a family. So if we don't have our immediate family here to support us, we need to build a village of our own and a strong community. And so, hey, it was like we babysat for like some of our friends so that they can go out on a date night, or, it's like, I'm struggling with like X, Y, or Z, can somebody help me? And, I do feel like as humans, like not only do we want to feel wanted, but we also want to help. And, I think that gives us a tremendous sense of purpose that would otherwise be lacking in a more, superficial in-person community or online community.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the connections between all of this, between, again, the tradition, the innovation, and then, the fruit, or hopefully the benefit of community coming away from that, but at the end of the day, if community isn't being born, then we've got one of the two is wrong, right, or off. Because I think to your point, right, that is the heart of what it is to be a human. To try to live, individually all on our own is going to fall apart. Either we lose the optimism, or we don't benefit maybe from the technological advancements. Something gets lost. And so it's almost like there's all three of these that have to be working in balance between themselves of again, tradition, innovation, and then, the benefit of community. So there's one last point, Brian, I'd like to have you share a little bit and talk about, because I'm just kind of curious to know this and more about it. I don't know anything. It's new to me. And I think it'll be, maybe it exemplifies, some of your own interests and passion and hobbies. But before, we do that, folks, if you've enjoyed this conversation and you've enjoyed connecting with Wyatt, I do encourage you to reach out to him with the Catholic Financial Planners Network. He's a top-notch advisor. He's, especially if you have a passion or interest in Bitcoin, I think he's going to be able to give you good guidance there. He's clearly an advocate for new things. And so if you're wanting to see like, well, what's coming on the horizon, what is new, I think Wyatt's going to be super helpful. So check out Catholic Financial Planners Network to connect with Wyatt or with any other advisor within the network. We're growing more and more every single month. Is awesome to see as this is starting to grow, gain some momentum. And so please look through all of the advisors at Catholic Financial Planners Network. We're only the host of this podcast. So Wyatt, to go back to this point of community, one of the items that you're a big fan of is "Yes in my backyard." It has an acronym, right? Is there like a little fancy way of saying this? Because this is completely new to me. I didn't know anything about it until your show. So can you tell me a little bit about this notion of "Yes in my backyard" and a general push of urbanism, and maybe how you're kind of seeing all of this pull together?
Definitely. Yeah, no, this is one of my favorite like side hobbies and passions. I kind of say like I'm an armchair like city planner, which just means I watch a bunch of like YouTube videos. But I do think like there's something like deeper here. I've done like some writings on this. And I do really enjoy thinking about it, but ultimately, it kind of stems from, I think cities themselves are technological, evolution, and, that is very much a good thing. I think they have propelled human flourishing and prosperity because, not only are we technological beings, but we're also social beings, and, we get a lot from, being together. My wife's from a small town in Iowa, and it's like very pleasant small town, but I always joke, or it's like, I really struggle to live there because I'm into some pretty niche things, right? And I don't have like other people. There's a smaller likelihood of people living there that are into like the same things like I'm into. And it's like, well, why would I want that like void, in my life if I can't, connect with, people that are interested in the same things I am. And so this whole thing, kind of comes about. So cities, technological, evolution, but they're also like the epicenter of our, culture. And it's like, almost like you can name like any cultural or technological innovation largely arose from a city, and that has nothing to do with like the streets. It has everything to do with people being together and talking and experiencing and sharing ideas and refining those ideas. And so YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard, kind of arose from NIMBY, which is No in My Backyard, which actually started I believe in the 60s or 70s in San Francisco. And, San Francisco, actually, the city limits like a very small city. And so this whole thing came about, it's like wealthy landowners, didn't want a, apartment building, built in their backyard. And I think this is more of a function of like the money being broken, which is why, I'm a Bitcoiner, because their prominent, store of value is their single family home. And so they are willing and, forcefully going to lengths to deny, other people or young families from, more housing being built. And, housing in cities, it's obviously, very hyper local. And so, if you have like a once flourishing city like, San Francisco that had a lot of technological innovation, so, people with talents were attracted there, but you have the current people living there. It's like, no, we don't want you. That's not very welcoming, right? And, it's like, I'm certainly not a fan of urban sprawl, and that's kind of like one of the reasons why I always, talk poorly about, cars and car culture is, our American cities, specifically are left with all these scars of a once seemingly positive, technological advancement. And so, if you can, I have an article on my website, I have an article and presentation on Bitcoin and urbanism. I tie how Bitcoin can rejuvenate urbanism, but there's some great graphics on there about Kansas City like before and after highway expansion. And so this happened in like the late 50s and early 60s, where we bulldozed our cities to build highways. And it's like, well, what did that do? It destroyed economically productive land, like coffee shops, your local grocery store, and replace it with just, a concrete slab that you can drive your car on. And ultimately, I think that really hurts our social fabric because, natural interactions between people are very positive. You're walking on the street, you bump into somebody, or, you walk, it's easy to walk into a coffee shop like you don't get in your little metal box, to drive somewhere and isolate yourself. In that presentation, I have a statistic where it's like 60, 70% of people drive alone to work each day. And so we've removed even the possibility of interacting, with our neighbors and being neighborly towards people, we don't know, which is obviously, a Christian, fundamental, in favor of like, minor conveniences, and so I think it's a real shame where, you completely eradicate like an urban core, and use Kansas City as an example because I did live there for a while. And if you just look at an aerial view, the downtown is completely circled by highways, and so people drive from the suburbs and like their square 1 acre by 1 acre lot or whatever it is, so spread out, not associated with people. An urban or built environment like that doesn't facilitate any sort of social, interaction. You can even see with like new subdivisions, like they'll frequently have like a community center with like a pool or something, because it was like clearly there was like this want or need for a community gathering spot, and so they've created like an artificial one. But what it really should be, and I think this is why I'm an urbanist, it's like, again, they were trying to reinvent the wheel and the problem was solved. It's called city. And so, people like are on, their big acre lots in the suburbs, get in their metal box, never interact with anybody, drive into, the city via highway network, go into an office building, and at 5 o'clock, downtown becomes a ghost town because there's nobody there, and it's like, so that's why I really, push back against like the car culture movement, because, it's destroyed, I think, what made people happy, to some extent. I understand it's like cities aren't for everybody. I'm not saying like it should be, but we shouldn't destroy, centers of culture and, the ability for people to, organically interact with each other. I think that's actually something we should encourage and is very healthy. And, unfortunately, specifically in America, it's not so much like this in Europe because you had big cities predominantly before the rise of cars. And so I think it's just kind of a cause I've taken up myself. And, it's like, you know what? I don't think this is right. So I'm going to advocate for something else.
Gosh, Wyatt, I just feel like this ties everything together. Like this example of what you're passionate about and your hobby and your focus and, one of your leading interests, it ties into the importance of tradition, the importance of innovation, but then also checking, that innovation. Because, again, not all innovation is great or awesome, as you were just alluding to, pulling it back and saying, well, does the work of innovation and tradition lead to community? Like, that's the final outcome to this. And if it's not leading to that, and again, one of those two, either innovation or tradition, has gotten us off in some way. Presumably, maybe it's the innovation, but maybe it's the tradition too. Maybe there's something that needs to be updated. That's kind of the notion of the innovation, is that it is seeking to update the tradition, and in itself becomes a tradition. I mean, that's kind of the great irony of this, is that anything that does get changed eventually becomes the new norm, and then that norm gets challenged at some point later on. And knowing when to hold fast to those norms and say, no, this norm has to stay. It's a reason why this norm was here, or versus saying, no, it's actually time to let go of this and allow new things to grow and develop. And we can change. Like it's a deep tension. Like it's not easy to know how to handle this. But I think our conversation at least, brought it to have it. Look, folks, the proof in the pudding is community. And so is this work leading to community building? And if it's not, then we got to say, no, something's off. So we got to go back to the drawing board and figure it out. Well, Wyatt, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. It's been great. It's been phenomenal. We didn't even get into Bitcoin. I know you're super passionate about that by and large. And so we'll have to have you back on, I think, on a round robin to have you share some of your expertise and thoughts on Bitcoin and your take on that in the future. But for the time being, if somebody wants to connect with you and maybe follow up based on this conversation today, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Absolutely. Most active on social media platforms, Twitter and LinkedIn, @ Wyatt O'Rourke _. You can find my Basilic's website, basilic.io. If you want, interested in some of my writings on urbanism and some of my more niche topics, you can find those at wyatt.o'rourke.com.
Awesome. Well, Wyatt, thanks so much again for being on. Audience, thanks so much for listening and being here and attentive. We love having you. If you got any topics or ideas that you want to pass our way, feel free to pass them on. We're looking forward to continue to grow the topic and create content that's relevant and of importance to you. So please reach out to the info@catholicfpn.com email address to pass some topics along to us. But between now and next time, please continue to reach out. We're here to serve your needs. So God's blessings to each and every one of you.
Hey, thanks so much, Ben. That was awesome.